So I think we can start now. I'd like to welcome you at the meeting with Professor Yoishiro Sato. My name is Jakub Knopp and I'm a member of the Student Society of the Pacific area. I'd like to welcome once again Professor Sato. He holds a PhD in philosophy from political science from University of Hawaii, and currently he is a visiting research fellow at the Yusof Ishak Institute. His main areas of interest include foreign and security policies of Japan and the Indo-Pacific region in general. So today we've gathered to discuss the legacy of Shinzo Abe, who has been brutally murdered on the 8th of July this year. The event sent shockwaves across Japan and brought back memories from the interwar period where political assassinations were ravaging the political scene of Japan during that time. Abe's legacy is not only limited to the foreign policy, but it also touches economic issues and wider changes in the Japanese society. His influence was not limited to just the other politicians and the LDP party, but it also reverberated across the Japanese society at large. And some experts argued that Abe laid down foundations of the new grand strategy of Japan in the new era. He was adept at difficult balancing act between regional powers such as China, the US, and Russia. And actually, I wrote an article on Abe after his death, where I compared him with the likes of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk or Karl Gustav Mannerheim because of his significance and impact on the psyche of Japanese people and his influence. And I hope that this parallel proves pertinent in the future as his successors will continue his legacy. And so first I'd like you, Professor, to lay out the historical background of the Japanese foreign policy, the main principles that the Japanese leaders were following in the Cold War era and up to the Abe's premiership.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, and it's very nice to be back in Warsaw. I unfortunately have one of my legs has been somewhat disabled, but I'm still mobile enough, and luckily I didn't hit my head anywhere, so I can still talk. And I guess, Prime Minister Abe, I think, not only his term as Prime Minister altogether during his two reigns, first back in 2008, and then second time as Prime Minister in late 2012 to 2 years ago when he resigned during the pandemic. Altogether, his term renewed the record, and he gets credited for the achievements in the foreign policy domain, and oftentimes his popularity, which is largely drawn from the foreign policy successes, are credited for his long term as a Prime Minister. But that's something often misunderstood outside Japan, because long-serving Prime Ministers in Japan are often not known for very bold external policy. Rather, the external policies, especially the post-World War II, was something politicians would rather avoid if they wanted to be re-elected and control the government for a long time. because there were many taboos in Japanese politics, you don't want to get near in terms of foreign policy orientations. Abe interestingly challenged some of those taboos and survived. It's true that we live in a different international environment today. The security situations in East Asia has drastically changed from the Cold War period, and somewhat it has become more complex, and Abe tried to address that new complexity in his foreign policy, but not very successfully. Okay. So first let me talk about what were the taboos in Japanese foreign policy, and then I'll try to explain why I think Abe's success is somewhat overrated, and third, why Abe survived. I mean, not literally, but Abe as a political leader managed to hold the government for a long time. So I'll try to talk about those three things. The first is the historical Japanese foreign policy post World War II, and many of you probably have learned about Japanese constitution and the pacifism. The Article 9 of the Constitution basically says that Japan will support the international order based on the multilateralism embodied in the United Nations framework, and Japan will entrust this international community for Japan's own security, and hence Japan will not possess means of war, military. So from the very beginning, Japan's rearmament was already touching the gray zone over the constitution. The government back then justified the creation and the existence of the self-defense forces by basically saying that the constitution does not deny Japan rights to self-defense. Japan will not invoke aggressive war against other countries or use threat of war in its diplomacy, but once Japan's already attacked, then the country should have rights to self-defense. So that was the argument the conservative government employed in order to justify rearmament of the country. The argument itself was made possible because the original draft of the constitution was slightly amended, and there was an amendment by a politician named Ashida, who was in the conservative party, and he basically added one kind of clause, dependent clause, to a sentence that Japan will not possess the military. And dependent clause said, in order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, comma. So by saying that the purpose of not arming is to refrain from the use of forces in foreign policy. So therefore, defensive armament is permissible. Well, initially the self-defense force was very reluctantly created, and domestic population, devastated by the war, and the civilians, they didn't want Japan to be dragged in the event of Soviet-US confrontation and a possible breakout of war in the East Asian front over Taiwan or over the Korean Peninsula. So the Japanese did minimal. But the Americans always wanted Japan to not only offer bases there, but help the American forces by any means possible. So even during the Korean War, that was back in 1953, and Japan didn't have the self-defense force yet in 1953. But when MacArthur was planning the Incheon landing, the US actually lined up former Japanese naval officers, and they were enlisted into the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard actually did participate in the Korean War by undertaking the sea mine removals from the Korean Peninsula and surrounding seas. So, and in fact, one of the demining ship accidentally touched the sea mine and exploded. So a life was lost during that operation. The government didn't disclose this for a long time. It was kept secret. So now we know that this participation took place, but it was, handled as a voluntary participation by individual Japanese nationals rather than the organized effort of the Japanese government. And in fact, the self-defense force never went as close as this demining operation in terms of taking part in the collective defense with the United States until 1991, and that was in the wake of the first Gulf War. The President Bush asked the Japanese Prime Minister Kaifu, and basically it was the height of the trade war over the semiconductor trade and all that, and US Congress was very angry for America's trade deficit against Japan. And in that context, Iran invaded Kuwait and threatened further invasion into Saudi Arabia, and the US decided to intervene with allies and some other countries in the multinational forces. Well, Bush asked Kaifu, what can Japan do? Well, the Cold War was over. Japan was, sort of breathing air in a more relaxed international security environment. And now the Soviet threat is gone. But then a crisis happened in the Middle East where Japan imports so much oil and gas from. So when Bush asked Kaifu, he was asking for significant Japanese military contributions. Well, Kaif said, okay, Japan will dispatch the demining fleet into the Persian Gulf and help demine the Persian Gulf. That was in the meeting in Houston between Kaifu and Bush father, not the young one. And then Kaif came back to Tokyo and told the fellow politicians, not only the opposition party, but within the ruling party itself, the largest faction who supported Kaif's the premiership, which is a product of compromise among several large factions who couldn't agree which faction should produce the prime minister. So Kaif, despite his very minor faction leadership position, Kaif was picked as a compromise among the powerful factional leaders within the party. Well, with this kind of weak political leadership, Kaif was already in trouble when he made a promise with Bush and came back. The largest faction, Takeshita faction, which backed Kaif's prime ministership, couldn't back the promise Kaif made. So several politicians defied the Prime Minister Kaifu, and the Takeshita, despite being a factional leader, couldn't, enforce the discipline over the party members, faction members, on this the pledge to deploy demining ships. So the Kaif failed to deliver the promise he made, and his cabinet collapsed. Eventually, the succeeding Prime Minister, Miyazawa, who was a former finance bureaucrat and who led one of the liberal factions within the Liberal Democratic Party, he was tasked to basically pick up the hot potato. So in 1992, Japan passed the peacekeeping operation law, and this law enabled overseas deployment of self-defense forces as a part of the United Nations peacekeeping operation. Well, what happened to demining? Well, Japan did send demining fleet after the war in the Persian Gulf finished. And well, Japan was bitterly criticized by the US Congress, and even the allies, when the Kuwaiti monarch about the ad space on the major newspapers in America to thank the coalition effort to liberate Kuwait. There were several flags of participating coalition nations, and Japan's flag was missing. And I don't know if the Kuwaiti was so mean, or maybe there was American pressure to do that, I don't know. But Japan made a financial contribution toward the US-led operation, and Japan eventually paid about 14 billion US dollars toward this operation, which amounted to about a quarter of the entire cost of the operation against Iraq. So it was a very sizable financial contribution appropriate for Japan's economic power back then in terms of the share of the GDP globally and so forth. But Japan is a country which buys blood with money, and Americans lost lives, so that made a difference. The human contribution was politically very important, which Japan didn't provide. Well, the demining ship went, and war might have been over, but that doesn't mean the sea is clear already. There were a lot of dangerous floating mines, and Japanese, even from the World War II period, they were very skilled. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force is very skilled in demining operation. So, in the future conflicts, maritime conflict anywhere, the Self-Defense Force will provide a very useful support if demining is required. Well, Japan is good because during the World War II, toward the end of it, US basically mined all major passages among the Japanese archipelago. So, not to really fight the war, but even for economic survival, Japan had to learn how to demine. The American submarines basically came so close to the Japanese archipelago and mined major straits throughout Japan, including the water. I today go snapper fishing all the time. American submarines were coming into that close, so Japan got good at it. But anyway, the peacekeeping operation law opened the path for overseas deployment of troops, and Japan has sent ground troops to peacekeeping operations in Cambodia, East Timor, and smaller basically not even units, but several personnel to observation posts in Golan Heights and supervising the election in El Salvador, and more recently the troops to South Sudan. So self-defense force has become a lot more active overseas, and all of those happened before Prime Minister Abe started changing the interpretation of the constitution and amending the laws, domestic laws, which are relevant to use of self-defense forces overseas. And those domestic laws include the self-defense force law itself, which went through a major amendment in 2014, together with the change of the interpretation of the constitution. Earlier, the regional contingency law, which was passed back in 1998 in the wake of the collapsing bilateral agreement between the US and North Korea over denuclearization of North Korea, and more literally, North Korea test-fired a ballistic missile over Japan for the first time. That was in 1988. So in that time, Japan passed a law which basically said, in the case of a contingency which has implications for Japan's security, Japan will provide supportive roles to the U.S. operations. The law deliberately avoided mentioning any specific geographical areas, which was a very sensitive matter, but also restrictive. So if you want to say something like that, one possibility is define East Asian geographic scope, because that's where Japan's security is most directly affected. And the law actually had in mind not only the Korean Peninsula and North Korea, but also the Taiwan Strait and China. In 1996, when Chen Shui-bian was running as a presidential candidate, China tried to intimidate the Taiwanese into not voting for Chen Shui-bian and conducted a massive test firing of ballistic missiles from the east coast of China into the Taiwan Straits. And again, back then the US dispatched 2 aircraft carrier groups to the region. Oftentimes, the US Act is kind of misquoted, and a lot of journalists and scholars write US sent 2 aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Straits. That's inaccurate. That was too dangerous to do already. Because China was developing a coastal defense forces and missile forces and bombers with anti-ship missiles and so forth. So the aircraft carriers alone going into the narrow Taiwan Straits, not happening. They went near Taiwan in a formation defended by destroyers. So, but that was a crisis. The Japanese leaders intended that in a similar crisis, Japan will use this law to justify sending naval ships to assist the US forces. But that law didn't permit Japanese forces to join combat operations. Basically, it was a rear support focused on logistics, search and rescue for the downed pilots, things like that. They tried to write in demining. Demining became a very controversial point. So, and even for transporting missiles and the shells and any kind of armament is excluded from the permissible transportation by the Japanese self-defense forces. So it was very limited support Japan could provide. And there were several other laws, time-limited legislation to enable dispatch of Navy self-defense force vessels to the Indian Ocean to aid American war against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And after the second Iraq war, 2004, Japan passed again sunset legislation. The legislation limited to a number of years in duration to authorize the self-defense force, ground self-defense force dispatch into Iraq to assist the post-war reconstruction efforts. So again, it's a non-combat mission, and Japanese self-defense forces units in Iraq had to be defended by coalition partners. So several countries undertook this escorting mission: Netherlands, Australia, and UK. They worked with the Japanese self-defense forces. Well, the government tried to suppress the bad news, but there was an incident. The anti-government forces in Iraq tried to attack the Japanese camp, and the mortar just landed by the sleeping area for the soldiers, and it was pure luck. Nobody died in that operation. And yeah, I heard it from the retired officer who was there during the operation. So, if anybody died in that operation, that could have really changed the course of Japan's participation in collective defense. Japanese people are so averse to, the casualties from war and conflicts. So they would have blocked the later government's effort to encourage the self-defense forces to take more active roles in collective defense. So 2014, Abe came and challenged this taboo against Japanese participation in collective defense. The government didn't say the constitution banned collective defense, but the government took an official interpretation of it to mean that Japan has a right to collective defense, but the current interpretation of the constitution bans collective defense. Abe appointed the cabinet member in charge of managing the interpretation of the constitution, and overnight interpretation was changed, and the government took the position that the constitution does give Japan rights to collective defense. So the letters of the constitution has not changed at all. It was one of Abe's campaign platform that Japan should change the constitution, and Abe made a promise to do that. He never brought it to the formal procedure and just stopped at amending the interpretation. Because amending the constitution is politically very difficult. It requires 2/3 majority in both chambers of the parliament, lower house and upper house. And Abe's party, even with the support of the coalition partner from another party called Komeito, never controlled 2/3 majority in both houses. They came close in the most recent election a year ago, but not quite. But there's one more party which support amending the constitution, and that's called Restoration Party, based on a very populist leader in Osaka, who is a lawyer in the background, and he's been running this kind of anti-Tokyo platform from the conservative side in Osaka. So the party is very popular in Osaka. The party has the largest number of parliamentary seats from districts in Osaka. The party has a majority and control the governor's position in Osaka and Osaka's prefectural legislature. Very popular, but not quite at the national level. At the national level, this Restoration Party cannot win the single-member district's seat. But the Japanese parliament also has a proportional representation, and in that portion, the Restoration Party wins some seats. So it's a formidable force in the national politics, and this party was very important for any kind of attempt at amending the constitution. Well, Abe never tried. He didn't bring it to the parliament. Even with passing with 2/3 majority, after that, the amendment proposal will go to a popular referendum where a simple majority needs to vote in favor. So none of those have happened. Kishida, when he was, elected the party leader of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party and took the role of the Prime Minister, and then went into a parliamentary election last year in autumn. It was expected by some that he would undertake the constitutional amendment, and that was the promise Kishida made with Abe, who was no longer Prime Minister but controlling the largest faction within the Liberal Democratic Party, and which candidate the Abe faction support, together with Abe's mate, other senior faction leader, who has been working together, Aso Taro, the former finance minister. The Aso faction, Abe faction together supported Kishida's candidacy against other candidates who wanted to be the party president and prime minister. So the renegade candidates like Kono Taro, Kono ran, and he was defeated by Kishida because Kono's candidacy was not supported by the two largest factions, Abe faction and Aso faction. So Kishida was expected he would carry out the supposed to be a promise with Abe. I'm not sure even if such promise existed, and if it did, Abe knows more than anybody else that it's not easy to carry out that kind of promise. And And probably they both figured undertaking a constitutional amendment immediately after the election is just too risky. The Kishida government may end up, with a very short term. So it was a political suicide for him to do. So 1 year ago, I was interviewed by several media and asked about the prospect of constitutional amendment. I made a comment. It's not happening within the first year. And that was because Kishida had enough time before the next election, and he is not gonna waste this the honeymoon period of very early high popularity period on risky things like that at the neglect of the immediate and ongoing problem of the pandemic, for example. So Kishida would focus on those domestic issues and continue on the general direction of foreign policy under Abe, but not going to gamble by touching the constitution. I think the prospect of constitutional amendment went even further because Kishida's popularity is now dwindling. There's a talk about the snap election anytime this autumn. So we'll see how long Kishida survives. And Abe's successors, two of them ended up with short term. Well, I mean, Kishida hasn't ended yet, but about to possibly. And Kishida's predecessor, Suga, it's very unfortunate. He did a great job running the country through that pandemic. I mean, Japan was probably, I would argue that among the major industrialized democracies, Japan was most successful at not resorting to a strong government hands against COVID. Partly because citizens are so obedient, and you don't have to threaten the Japanese with punishments to tell them they have to put the mask on. They will. Actually, one day I was taking a train from Narita Airport into Tokyo, and all of a sudden, people were screaming and running from the car in front of my car on the train, and I was like, what's happening? I thought it was terrorism or something. So I looked into that, and I saw a foreign national looked somewhere South Asia, maybe Bangladesh or Nepal, I couldn't tell. But anyway, he didn't have a mask on, and I think he found it kind of funny that the Japanese were panicking. And so he was chasing those people, and then he came into my car and sat right there, and everybody was like, looking at him like this. And then the train stopped at the next stop and didn't leave the next station. And then, some railroad officials came on board and started looking for, the cause of the disturbance. And then the guy just sitting there as if he did nothing. And other people didn't even bother to report. So I was like, so I explained what happened. Then the train officials escorted him off the train, and the train departed. But I don't think he got punishment. I mean, no arrest, because there's no law in Japan against not wearing a mask during the corona pandemic. So he would have been preached by police officers or whatever, but eventually I'm sure he was released. So.
Okay, so Professor, I think due to the time constraints, I'd like to move on to the Q&A session.
Yes.
So if anyone has a question for the professor, then please raise your hand or
Sir, I just want to know that what is the long-term security policy of Japan? I mean, if you see the threats from the China, if you see the threats from the North Korea, so what is the long-term policy? How, because Japan cannot no longer depend on the United States. So anyhow, Japan has to become self-dependent as far as deterrent capability is concerned. So what is your perspective?
Japan hasn't decided that the country cannot depend on the United States anymore. I think the official policy is to depend on the United States as long as possible and ensure that the US doesn't withdraw its commitment to the security of the region and the defense of Japan. So the current policy into the future is to keep US engaged and increase Japan's contribution to collective defense to the minimum extent that is necessary to keep the US engaged. So it's different from Japan before World War II. Japan went on the path of heavy militarization to confront basically all neighbors, the Soviet Union, China, and the United States. And strategy in their mind was to make peace with which country and to confront which countries. But Japan had to be strong, and in the end, strategy didn't work. Japan couldn't quickly finish the war with China. Japan couldn't prevent the war from breaking out against the United States. And neutrality with the Soviet Union collapsed toward the end of the World War II. So that was a very failed strategy. And in the post-World War II, the dominant security planners in the Liberal Democratic Party, they placed the alliance with the United States at the forefront of the strategy. And that orientation hasn't changed. But several prime ministers were a little more nationalistic than others. So they would try to promote Japan's own kind of autonomous defense posture and force structure in the guise of helping the Americans. And military capabilities, it's a sort of gray zone. The same capability can boost Japan's autonomous defense posture. It can also boost Japan's role in the collective self-defense. For example, the long-range transport aircraft. Japan can use it independently for evacuating citizens or maybe even making minor interventions in some remote countries. But Japan can also use it in the coalition effort. So, but at the moment, I think the supporters for the autonomous defense based on the kind of right-wing nationalism is a minority. And all successful prime ministers in foreign policy, like Nakasone during the 1980s, and Koizumi in the early 2000s, Abe, they all supported the collective defense rather than the autonomous defense policy. But having said that, Abe is a strategic thinker, and I should point out that Abe tried to work independently in the relationship with Russia. Instead of just following the Europe and United States, Abe tried to run Japan's autonomous diplomacy toward Russia. So, after Russia declared annexation of Crimea, Western countries went into a limited sanction. But Abe invited Putin for a summit meeting in his hometown, and he booked a nice traditional inn for Putin to negotiate the return of the disputed northern territory, which Russia occupied after Japan's surrender and illegally hold to this date. Abe was ready to make compromise. Japan has maintained the position that all 4 islands Japan claimed must be returned, but Abe was exploring a possibility of a compromise, and not compromise as a first step, but even a possible compromise as a final resolution. It was one of Abe's pet agenda, and his father was very much into that too. So Abe had a strong commitment to the issue. Well, on the day of the negotiation, Putin came several hours late.
And now he has to wait for other leaders to show up during the last meeting, for example.
Typical Russian tactic. And he wasn't successful. Good thing he didn't bring the dog.
Yeah, like with Merkel.
Yeah, I think the Japanese quarantine was too restrictive. So anyway, but here again, it's not just Abe, but Japan has a somewhat divergent strategic interest when it comes to Russia. Japan needs to diversify the energy supplies away from Middle East, and in the post-Cold War period, Japanese companies obtained stakes in the gas field in Sakhalin, and Putin's trying to buy it back, and he's been intimidating those companies, first by citing environmental code violations and suspending the operation of the gas field and so on. It's just a political pressure that he generates in order to force the companies to sell part of the shares to Putin's own cronies. But Japan's holding to the remaining share, and despite ongoing Russian invasion in Ukraine, Japan still, hold the stake. Japan announced it intends to hold those stakes and keep importing the gas. So that's different from the U.S. interest. I mean, U.S. They have also interest from the energy politics perspective. This is not this ongoing conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. It's not only about the territories there, and it's also about the pipeline gas diplomacy and Europe's dependence on Russia that the U.S. doesn't like to see, and there are some the personal stakeholders like the former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl had interest in the gas business and so forth, and the Biden's the backers in the energy industries, they want to see higher energy price. So it's a very complicated issue.
Okay, so do we have any more questions? Okay, this is going to be the last one as well because we're running out of time.
So, could I ask whether Sato Sensei has any opinion about changing the constitution, whether it would be beneficial for Japan or not, and what's the reason behind it?
The people have talked about Japan's elastic constitution because the constitutional interpretation stretches like a rubber band. But the legal experts don't like this. The liberal lawyers think it's terrible. The constitution is already violated, and the conservative lawyers, even they think that overstretching the interpretation threatens the foundation of legal law-based governance. So they support the amendment. Well, Japan has done all these points without changing the constitution. Japan has done quite a bit because now Japan can undertake the supportive role in, not only in Japan's own neighborhood, but in remote areas. And the partners are no longer limited to the United States. The amendment in 2015 of the Self-Defense Force law opened the path for, supporting the Australian ships and US ships, maybe South Koreans if they are part of the coalition war effort, and UK, France, whoever might send ships to the conflict areas, they are eligible for receiving Japanese support. And Japan's signing the AXA, that is acquisition and cross-servicing agreement with all those countries I mentioned, and India also. So they will work closely together, and Japan can provide a repair service to the coalition ships in Japan's docks, provide fuels and other support. And after Japan's already attacked, Japan can even provide ammunition to the coalition ships and aircraft also. So, all these achievements since Abe became Prime Minister happened without amending the constitution itself. So, to put it in the reverse way, any kind of constitutional amendment that would happen is going to be only endorsing what the government has already achieved in terms of tangible participation of self-defense forces in collective defense efforts. But in my view, even that is recommended because I come from the conservative legalist tradition. My background, undergraduate major was not politics, it was law. And 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, as an undergraduate student, I was writing kind of junior thesis on the topic of constitutionality of collective defense. And when Abe came to power and politicians and legal scholars writing about this issue, I was feeling a deja vu. I've been there. And yeah, my professor gave me an A for the paper. So anyway, it was I would recommend the modest amendment to the Constitution to catch up the reality of the ground.
Okay, so thank you, Professor. I think we're gonna wrap up the meeting. So I think it's worth quoting at the end Professor Stephen Nagy, who said that Abe was the most consequential and decisive and luckiest leader in the history of Japan. I think it's a good quote to finish.
Lucky.
Yeah, with the emphasis on lucky.
His luck ran out in the end, I think.
Yeah, no, it was tragedy. But yeah, also would like to note that the audio recording will be available on YouTube as well, so you can go back to it or send it to your friends. And on the 11th of October as well, there's going to be a booth with our organization as well in this building. So if you're interested in our society and other activities, then feel free to join us then on next Tuesday. So thank you again.
One advertising. Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University, where I'm from, is exchange partner of the University of Warsaw's International Relations Department. So please try to spend some time in Japan if you're interested. And the living cost in the rural part of Japan is really minimal. So you don't feel like you came to big cities in America or Tokyo. So good fishing, good food, very enjoyable.